Hi, everybody. I hope you're still doing well. I've been hearing from a lot of you, and um, you seem to be doing a pretty good job of being caught up. If you feel like you're falling behind, just take it step by step. Go back and do assignment number one, and um, just go back to the first assignment and take it one step at a time. They say, how was the Great Wall of China built? One brick at a time, and that's how we're going to get through this class. Today, I want to talk a little bit about our poetry, where we've moved from fiction to poetry. So try to get caught up on the fiction as much as you can so we can work into the poetry. Now, first of all, we have to define what poetry is. And that's a tricky one because some people say, well, poetry is something that rhymes, but there's a lot of poetry that doesn't rhyme. Some people say poetry is done in stanzas and verse, but then there's a thing called prose poetry that doesn't do that. Some people say, well, poetry is written down, but then there's spoken word poetry, which is actually quite uh, popular. And once we get through this coronavirus mess, maybe people will be able to go to cafes and things and listen to spoken word poetry again. And I think even song lyrics can and often do uh, fall under the category of poetry. I mean, that's why there's lyric poetry and there's narrative poetry. The term lyrics in songs comes originally from poetry, which comes from the term lyre, which the poets of ancient Greece used to go around and they'd play this instrument, a lyre, and they'd basically speak their poetry. So poetry really came from a spoken source turned into written and then has remained spoken, in my opinion. So for me, poetry can be everything from, at least in English, from Beowulf, the oldest known epic narrative poem that we have, all the way to contemporary music, rap music, spoken word poetry, and everything in between. Now, one of the things I want to prepare you for, April is National Poetry Month, and the Academy of American Poets every year holds a program. They run a program they call Poem in Your Pocket, and the idea behind it is that you go and you get a poem that speaks to you that you really like, and you share it with people. So they started off by having people have the poem in the pocket. They're having a poem written down in their pocket, and they'd pull it out and read it to people, strangers, friends, family, whatever. In Miami, that might get you mugged, and right now we're on social distancing, so you can't do that anyway. But what I would like you to do is to find a poem, and this isn't for this week, this is really for next week, but I want you to be looking for one now. Find a poem that speaks to you. And I think we all have poems that speak to us. They can be spoken word, they can be song lyrics, they can be anything you want that you think is a poem. And what I'd like you to do is take that poem and either I'll put up a discussion board for it, and I want you to either post that poem. If you can, read it to us. If you can do it on an audio or video file, read the poem to us. And then tell us a little bit about, you can do that either orally or you can write it down. And matter of fact, if you don't have the wave, the bandwidth or whatever to do a video, you can write the poem down or post it or post a link to it if you'd like, or post a link to it of the poet even reading the poem. But I do want you to also tell us why that poem speaks to you, why that poem is important to you, what it says to you. I don't care what the critics say that it says, that's irrelevant. Why did you pick it? Why do you like it? I would like you to pick poems by people that are at least somewhat professional. So I don't want you to go to the amateur poetry boards and find poems by amateurs, because even though they might not speak to you, I do want to have something that's been vetted a little bit, at least through someone, an editor or something. And some of these poetry boards, anybody can post up anything, and that doesn't necessarily mean it is really good for a college class like this one. Okay. But this could be any poem that speaks to you, from, again, from Beowulf, if you can understand it in Old English, all the way up to music or rap. And if you can if it's music and you can post a link to it, that's fine. I'd also encourage international students to post poems from their culture, if you possibly can. And if you can post them in both the original language, especially if you can read it or if the poet is reading it, we'd love to hear what it sounds like, and then do a translation for us so we know what it really means. I think that's really a cool thing. It's an opportunity we have in a university like this that is so diverse, that we can have poetry from around the world, not just from around the corner. Okay, so with that in mind, my definition of poetry is very, very liberal. It encompasses a lot of different things in it, so that you don't have to feel like it's only you can only use Shakespeare. As a matter of fact, I'd be surprised if people did use old poetry. William Blake seems to be pretty popular, but other than that, most people pick modern stuff. Okay, now I have posted the things on the old poetry. We've had a really good discussion in some of the discussion boards on how language changes, and you can see from Beowulf to Middle English to Shakespearean English, which is considered early modern English, to today, which would be contemporary English. You can see how things have changed so much along the way, and a lot of it is just a simplification thing, as people are inherently, I hate to put it this way, but they're inherently lazy, and if they can say something simpler than complicated, they do, and so they tend to condense things. They tend to come up with more specific words for things. They tend to use 1 and 2 syllable words instead of 4 or 5 syllable when they can, particularly in conversation, and that's why language has changed. One of the reasons why language has changed so much. Spelling, not so much, because spelling is a lot. Once it gets written down and preserved, it's really hard to change the spelling of a word, but the pronunciation will change regardless. So a word like knight, like a medieval knight, back in Chaucer's time was pronounced knight, and that's a mouthful. So now we just say night like N-I-T-E. It's a lot simpler. I'd like you to also look at how rhyme has changed. So Shakespeare had these, and Milton too, they both had these really structured sonnets with a particular rhyme scheme, a particular meter, a particular pattern, 14 lines. Matthew Arnold changed that up a little bit. If you can see in Dover Beach, that poem is the rhyme scheme, there's a rhyme in there, but it's a little more variable, and he uses a device called enjambment. So if you get to the end of the line, you don't stop at the rhyme, you just run it right through. The way you read a poem, by the way, is exactly the way the punctuation tells you. You don't stop unless there's a period. You don't pause unless there's a comma. So if one line runs into the other without any punctuation, you just read it like a sentence. And when you do that, you can see that the rhyme does not stand out as much in a poem like Dover Beach and some of Robert Frost's poems when we get into them as well. The rhyme is a little bit more disguised, because we don't want, or poets don't want it to sound all alike. It's a way of avoiding sounding like a Hallmark greeting card, really. If you look at William Carlos Williams, he's got a poem called The Red Wheelbarrow that sometimes people wonder if it really is a poem. He's called one of the Imagist poets, though, because he takes an image. He says no ideas but in things, and you can see that his ideas are really things. So he takes the red wheelbarrow, it is a thing, and he gets an idea from it. He gets plums in the refrigerator that he ate. Sorry, I hate the plums. Boy, they were good. It's a thing, but it turns into an idea when he puts it in his poetry like that. Walt Whitman, he was the guy that really changed poetry in America, he took sort of British poetry really is pretty stuffy when you look at it. Whitman took it and just threw out all the rhyme and meter and all that kind of thing and invented a new kind of poetry called free verse. You can see that in Song of Myself, and if you look up any other Whitman poems, there's only a few of them that are real. I mean, Whitman could write in structure if he wanted to. Oh, Captain, my Captain is one example of that, about the death of Abraham Lincoln, and when lilacs last in the something, I can't remember the name, bloomed, is another one. But most of his poetry is really free verse, and he invented that. He goes back to, it's I can't really say he invented it completely, but he uses techniques, particularly from the Old Testament and the Bible, which does a lot of repetition. And if you're familiar with any Old Testament things, and in the beginning there was this, and there was this, and this one beget that, and this one beget that, the Bible uses a lot of repetition rather than rhyme. And Whitman went back and used that. He also picked up on the oratory of his time. In the 1860s, they didn't have mass media, they didn't have television. If you were a candidate running for president, you did these, they called them whistle stops. And they got on the back of a train, they'd get on the caboose on the back end of a train, and the presidential candidate would go from town to town, would stop at every station, and would give a speech. And the speech making of that time, the oratory, was a really big deal. That's how people got elected. People would come out and listen to the presidential candidate. And you can even see, I think Obama, that was one of his real strengths. He had oratory skill. And they used a lot of repetition. Martin Luther King Jr., I have a dream. The same thing, I have a dream today. I dreamed this, and I dreamed that, and I dreamed this. So Whitman really took those skills. I know Martin Luther King was contemporary, but he took the skills from the orators of his time, from the public speakers, and he incorporated them into poetry. It's very, very effective. Most modern poetry today, if you pick up a journal of contemporary poetry, like, say, Poetry Magazine, or the Poetry Journal it's called, and look at it, most of the poems in it are going to look a lot more like Whitman's poetry than they will look like Shakespeare's. Free verse has become well accepted, and few people, I'd say probably 25% maybe of the poems written today are written in rhyme and meter, and the rest of them are some variation of free verse. Okay, so I wanted to give you a little bit of heads up about that. I want you to start looking for some poems, or look for a poem that speaks to you in some way. The Academy of American Poets website is really good for that. If you go to some of the poems I've posted, that's where they come from. But if you just look like the Academy, I think it's called poets.org is the actual website. There's another one called the Poetry Foundation. Those poems are all copyright free. You can read them. They don't cost you anything to look at. And that's why I'm able to post links to these as well. Next week, I'm going to turn the corner and get into some more modern contemporary poetry. I'm probably going to look at Langston Hughes. Langston Hughes, a brilliant poet, very, very much indebted to Walt Whitman, by the way. And Langston Hughes admitted that. He said that basically he learned poetry writing from Walt Whitman. He uses Whitman-esque techniques, I guess you would call it. So we'll sort of turn the corner into more modern poetry, and I'll put up a board for you to post your poems that speak to you. And what I really want to know is the name of the poem and the poet, and then either post the poem, post a video of you reading the poem, an audio of the poem, a link to a website where the poet is reading the poem or the artist is singing. And you can use spoken word poetry, you can use song lyrics, you can use written down poetry, whatever speaks to you. But I want it to be a poem that has meaning for you, not just something you randomly pick out of a book. and again, tell us why this poem has meaning, what it says to you, why it speaks to you the way it does. I have a pile of poems that sort of have meaning to me. So many I can't even probably think of them. Some come out of Shakespeare. I really love the line from Hamlet, "To thine own self be true," for example, is I think a really great one. It comes from the speech in Hamlet, "Neither a borrower nor a lender be," and he goes on and on. But "to thine own self be true," I think is a really important line. So with that, thank you all for your patience and staying on board with this thing. And I'd like to remind you, I don't think many of you need it, but if you felt the need to take this class pass-fail, you can do that. There's on ULearn, there's a form that you fill out. If any of you need that form or you want that form and can't find it, let me know and I'll get it to you. But this is a class that if you do your work and you're conscientious about it, you should do really well. This is not poetry and literature. It's not rocket science. It's not cell biology. I'm not smart enough to teach, organic chemistry. So it is what it is. And this is a class just to really help you get well-rounded in your thinking, to think out of the box a little bit, to do some critical thinking. So I'm expecting that you're all going to do well on this. But again, if you feel like you need to do anything pass-fail, just fill out the form, and I'm going to continue to grade you with a letter grade, but at the end in your final grade roster, it will come up to put either a P for pass or an F for a fail. Okay, stay well. Even my barn is closed for the moment, so I can't go out and see my horses. Although I think next week they're going to start giving us, each of us, a 1.5 hour time slot where just, each boarder can go and pet their horse and ride their horse, so that there'll be only 1 or 2 people there at a time. But until then, I've basically been stuck in the house. Been doing a lot of reading, watching a lot of movies, reading a lot of your papers and discussion boards. And by the way, those of you that have shared selfies with me, I really appreciate that. That helps me keep connected to the class and make me feel that I'm teaching real people rather than just responding. I may try to get onto Blackboard Collaborate and do a live stream. I haven't done this yet. I've got to figure out how to make it work. And I'm not sure how many of you have the technical capability with your computers or your bandwidth or whatever to do it anyway. But I am going to try to do. I'm going to try it with my Stephen King class first and see how it works out and see if it winds up being a nightmare or not. But in the meantime, at least you got me on video here, and I got to get my wife to get the scissors or something because I can't get a haircut now. It's getting in my face. Stay well, and we're at just about the halfway mark now, so it's downhill from here, which if you're behind, I know that seems like a bad thing, but you should be able to catch up in this class. You really should. And if you're caught up, I mean, you just got to roll, you just got to ride the sled down to the bottom now. Okay. Thank you, and have a great day, and stay well. Bye-bye.